Climate Law Matters, Climate Attribution in Litigation. Interview with Dr Matt Ösund-Ireland. Hello listener, welcome back to our podcast, Climate Law Matters, in which we explore the key legal developments across different sectors to address the issue of climate change. I'm Christopher Moss, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers, specialising in planning and environmental law. In this episode, I'm really excited to be joined by Dr Matt Ösund-Ireland, a partner at HKA. Matt is a chartered environmentalist with over 30 years of experience in supporting commercial organisations, governments, and financial institutions with strategy, environmental compliance, impact assessments, and due diligence. Matt holds a doctorate in local air quality management and climate change and a degree in combined science. He's a member of the Institution of Environmental Sciences and the Institute of Air Quality Management. Thank you for joining us, Matt. Could you start by telling us a bit about your background and experience in climate litigation?
Hi, thank you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me. Well, my background is somewhat unusual because I came into this area from the science and policy side rather than purely through legal practice. My expertise includes the interface between local air quality management and climate change, and I've spent more than 30 years advising governments, infrastructure operators, financial institutions, and major corporates on environmental risk, climate change, carbon management, and sustainability issues, and I've been doing that in more than 30 countries. Over that time, I've worked across sectors including aviation, energy, transport, waste, manufacturing, and major infrastructure. I've acted as an expert witness in numerous planning inquiries and appeals, and have been cross-examined on issues including carbon emissions, climate resilience, air quality, and environmental policy. More recently, that has included airport expansion projects and energy from waste. I've also presented evidence and been cross-examined on air quality and climate-related issues for surface transport and power generation projects. Alongside that, I've led climate resilience and climate risk work, developed carbon management strategies and greenhouse gas inventories across multiple sectors, worked on climate-related financial disclosures, and advised governments on climate and environmental policy. So, while my perspective comes primarily from the scientific and technical side, much of my work sits directly alongside legal processes, which is why I'm particularly interested in how climate attribution science is increasingly being used in litigation and disputes.
Brilliant. So a whole host of experiences then. On the podcast, we've previously discussed the International Court of Justice's July 2025 advisory opinion on the obligation of states in respect of climate change. At paragraph 436 of that judgment, the court opined that the existing legal standard for establishing causation, namely that there must be a sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus between the wrongful act and the injury suffered, is capable of being applied to harm arising from states' non-compliance with obligations to protect the climate system from harm caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So starting with the basics, what is attribution science and how does this relate to the question of causation?
In the context of climate change, and at its simplest, attribution science seeks to answer three related questions. The first, whether human activities have contributed to climate change. And secondly, whether climate change influenced a particular event or impact, such as a heat wave, a flood, or wildfire. And thirdly, what proportion of that contribution can be attributed to particular sectors, countries, or even organisations. What attribution science does is to provide an evidence-based framework for understanding the causal links. Scientists can answer the first two of these three questions with increasing confidence to determine whether human-induced climate change made a particular event more likely or more severe. For example, instead of simply saying that a heat wave occurred, scientists can now estimate how much climate change increased the probability or intensity of that heat wave. We can come back to the third question later. From a legal perspective, causation is rarely an all or nothing question. Courts regularly deal with situations involving multiple contributing causes. The fact that a harm has several causes does not necessarily mean that causation cannot be established. Attribution science provides courts with a more robust evidential basis for analysing these causal relationships. That is why the International Court of Justice observation is so important. The court was effectively recognising that established legal principles of causation are capable of being applied to climate-related harm. The challenge is not that climate change is somehow beyond the reach of causation analysis. Rather, the question becomes whether the available scientific evidence is sufficient to demonstrate the required causal connection in a particular case. In many respects, attribution science is helping to close what was once perceived as a gap between climate science and legal responsibility. Of course, it does not determine liability by itself because courts still have to consider issues such as duty, foreseeability, and remedies, but it provides an increasingly sophisticated means of answering the fundamental question at the heart of many climate cases. To what extent did the conduct in question contribute to the harm that occurred? So let me try and summarize this. If climate litigation is ultimately about causation, attribution science is the discipline that allows us to move from saying climate change played a role to asking how much of a role did it play and can we quantify it?
So I think we are starting to see attribution science play a direct role in climate litigation. For example, in May 2025, a German court handed down judgment in Luciano Liua against RWE. RWE are a German utility company with a long history of coal-fired energy production. The claimant was a farmer in the Peruvian Andes who faced a risk from flooding caused by glacial retreat associated with rising temperatures. And his case sought RWE to pay a share of costs for protective measures proportional to the company's historical emissions. Now, the claim was ultimately dismissed on the facts, but in getting there, the court relied significantly on attribution science to establish a causal link between the company's emissions and the increased risk of harm. So how do you calculate an individual company or state's contribution to global warming?
Thank you for that question, Chris. This is really another way of asking the question we referred to earlier. What proportion of that contribution to global warming can be attributed to particular sectors, countries, or even organisations? So broadly speaking, there are 4 links in the chain of evidence. First, we know that with a very high level of confidence, the greenhouse gas emissions from human activities drive global warming. Second, we can estimate how much warming has occurred as a result of those emissions. Third, we can determine how that warming has altered the probability or severity of particular impacts, such as glacial retreat, heat waves, flooding, or sea level rise. And finally, we can estimate the contribution of particular states, sectors, or companies to the emissions that had caused the warming in the first place. To provide answers to the first, second, and final links, a widely used tool is MAGIC, the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change. MAGIC represents the Earth system with a small number of equations describing the atmosphere, oceans, carbon cycle, and energy balance. It converts historical greenhouse gas emissions, aerosol emissions, and natural influences such as volcanic eruptions and solar changes into estimates of atmospheric concentrations, radiative forcing, that's the change in the Earth's energy balance, and global mean temperature change, as well as other climate indicators such as sea level rise. Important to note that, although greenhouse gases are reported annually, it is the accumulation of gases in the atmosphere that drives global warming. Climate models such as MAGIC provide us with a historical record of global warming based on natural and anthropogenic emissions from a time before the Industrial Revolution and verified with reference to temperature measurement records. Of course, knowing the relative contribution to global warming does not tell us the increased likelihood or intensity of a specific event, such as a heat wave or tornado, or in this case, glacial melt. This requires much more complex climate modelling than using tools such as MAGIC. These more complex models can take weeks to run on mainframe computers. To illustrate by example, if a company is responsible for, say, 0.5% of cumulative global emissions, attribution models such as MAGIC can estimate the extent to which that contribution has influenced global temperature increases, sea level rise, or other climate indicators. The science does not suggest that the company single-handedly caused the climate change. Rather, it quantifies its contribution to the change. The more complex models can be used to determine the extent that climate change has changed the risk of a specific event occurring, in terms of the increased likelihood or intensity. It follows then, if we know the contribution made to climate change, we can infer a company's contribution to the change in risk of a specific event occurring. Again, and importantly, the focus is on contribution to risk rather than sole causation. What's particularly important about the Liua v. RWE case is that the court was prepared to engage with that chain of reasoning. The claimant's case relied on linking RWE's historic emissions to global warming, linking that warming to glacial retreat in the Andes, and linking the glacial retreat to an increased flood risk affecting the claimant's property. Although the claim ultimately failed, as you say, the court accepted that in principle such causal links can be examined through attribution science. From a legal perspective, attribution science does not eliminate the challenges of proving causation, but it moves the discussion from a qualitative argument that everyone contributed to a quantitative assessment of how much did each party contribute. That is a question courts are much more accustomed to addressing. In other words, attribution science is increasingly converting climate change from a problem of diffuse responsibility into one of measurable contribution. Whether that contribution ultimately gives rise to legal liability remains a matter for the courts, but the science is providing a far more precise evidential foundation than was available even a decade ago. That's one of the most interesting questions in attribution science because climate change is a cumulative problem. Carbon dioxide can remain in the atmosphere for centuries, so today's warming reflects the accumulation of emissions over a very long period of time. In practice, attribution studies often go back as far as reliable emission records allow. For states, that can mean looking at emissions from the Industrial Revolution onwards. For major fossil fuel producers and other large emitters, research use historical production and emissions data to estimate contributions over many decades. That's the scientific answer. However, courts might ask additional questions such as, what was known about climate risks at the time? When did the risks become reasonably foreseeable? And when did states or companies become aware of the potential consequence of their actions? When did the potential harm associated with greenhouse gas emissions become foreseeable to a company board or a government? Some might argue that corporate knowledge becomes relevant from the period during which major energy companies and governments began commissioning and publishing research on climate risks, in the early 1980s, for example. Or we might argue 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, or perhaps 1995, when the IPCC's second report stated, the balance of evidence suggests that there is a discernible human influence on global climate. A more pragmatic approach might be to say, let's all agree we start counting from this day forward. Whichever start date is agreed, there is clearly substantial work to sufficiently describe the historical activity of the company or state and back-project annual emissions data. The risk of misreporting or greenwashing, or the failure of carbon offset schemes, also needs to be considered. None of these risks is new, but we may expect a more forensic accounting type approach to any investigation, going beyond the requirements of carbon reporting as part of annual disclosures. So having said all that, the short answer is that attribution science often looks back over the entire history of emissions, but the legal significance of those emissions may vary depending on what was known and when.
So, continuing with the complexities of quantification, climate change is obviously an international crisis, and we are now seeing, as in the RVA case, claims being brought across borders, or indeed across the entire Atlantic Ocean. How does the international element impact the question of attribution?
One way to think about this is that climate attribution is not the first environmental problem involving transboundary impacts. In many respects, we've seen similar issues before with acid rain, ozone pollution, and particulate matter, as PM10 or PM2.5. Earlier in my career, much of my work focused on air quality management, emission inventories, and atmospheric dispersion modelling. One of the key lessons from that work is that pollutants do not respect political boundaries. Sulfur dioxide emitted in one country can contribute to acid deposition hundreds of kilometres away. Ozone is often formed through complex atmospheric reactions involving emissions from multiple jurisdictions. Fine particulates can be transported across cities, regions, and national borders. For example, there are occasional episodes of red dust in the UK, which are in fact particulates originating from the Sahara. The international dimension is not necessarily a scientific obstacle. In many ways, atmospheric science has always dealt with pollutants crossing borders. The differences with climate change are the spatial and temporal scales and the number of contributing sources. The RWE case illustrates this perfectly. The claimant was in Peru, the defendant was in Germany, and the alleged harm arose from glacial retreat in the Andes. Yet the court was prepared to examine whether emissions from a German company formed part of a scientifically demonstrable causal chain leading to increased flood risk on another continent. We should note here, of course, that not all courts may take the same view. In terms of air quality science, the international element does not represent a barrier to determining attribution. We have spent decades quantifying how emissions travel through the atmosphere and contribute to environmental harm far from their source. Climate attribution is applying many of those same principles. However, the international element does become more challenging in law. Attribution science can quantify contribution across borders. The courts must then decide what legal significance to attach to that contribution in terms of responsibility, liability, and remedies.
So I think having got a better understanding of the science and how this all works, turning to litigation, what's the role of an expert witness when it comes to questions of climate attribution?
Well, the role of an expert witness is not to advocate for a particular outcome. Our role is to assist the court by providing independent scientific and technical evidence on matters that fall outside ordinary judicial knowledge. Importantly, the expert's role is not to answer the ultimate legal question of liability. That's for the court. The expert's role is to explain the relevant scientific evidence. In the context of climate attribution, that does often mean explaining the chain of causation in a way that is scientifically rigorous, but also understandable to judges, tribunals, and lawyers. We may be asked to explain how greenhouse gas emissions contribute to warming, how that warming influences particular physical impacts, and what level of confidence can be attached to those conclusions. From my perspective, there are strong parallels with the air quality and climate change cases in which I've acted as an expert witness. Whether we're considering compliance risk with air quality standards or the risk of events associated with climate change, the court is often dealing with a common challenge: multiple sources, complex atmospheric processes, and impacts occurring some distance away from the original emission source. For example, in air quality work, we routinely use emission inventories, monitoring data, and atmospheric models to determine how much a particular source contributes to pollution concentrations at a particular location. We might be asked whether a power station, airport, highway, or industrial facility contributed materially to an exceedance of an air quality standard. Climate attribution raises similar questions, albeit over much larger geographical and temporal scales. As we've discussed, this includes analysis of records to calculate a company or state's historical and cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases, identifying when a company or state could foresee the harm of those emissions and what it did about it, calculating the contribution to global warming, and subsequently their contribution to the risk of a climate change-related event occurring. Turning to standard of proof, one of the most important aspects of expert evidence is explaining uncertainty. Science rarely deals in absolutes. The court needs to understand not only the central conclusion, but also the confidence intervals, assumptions, and limitations of the analysis. A good expert helps the court understand both the strengths and boundaries of the science. This has been important for air quality over the last 30 years, and is now particularly important in climate litigation because, although attribution science has advanced enormously, it is still developing. Different studies may produce slightly different estimates depending on the datasets, methodologies, and assumptions used. The expert role is to help the court navigate those differences objectively.
So we've focused on attribution science in the context of climate litigation. In what other ways is it relevant to your clients?
Whilst attribution science is attracting attention because of climate litigation, I would argue that its greatest impact may ultimately be outside the courtroom. Increasingly, governments, regulators, infrastructure owners, financial institutions, and businesses are using attribution science to understand risk, inform investment decisions, and improve resilience. I hinted on this a little earlier when discussing compliance with air quality standards for PM10 and PM2.5. At its core, climate attribution science helps answer a very practical question. Is what we're experiencing simply weather variability, or is it evidence of a changing climate that requires action? That distinction has enormous implications for planning and investment. Let's take the water sector as an example. Around the world, water utilities and regulators are increasingly using attribution studies to understand drought and flood risk. Taking one of the landmark studies as an example, Cape Town's near day zero water crisis between 2015 and 2018 led to attribution research helping assess the risks to which climate change may contribute to the severity of future droughts. That evidence informed long-term resource planning, demand management, investment in alternative supplies, and wider adaptation strategies. In other words, it linked attribution science to future risk management. Public health is another area where attribution science has become increasingly important. We're now seeing studies move beyond asking whether climate change influenced a heatwave to estimating its human consequences. Researchers from Imperial College London, the Met Office, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have calculated that climate change added between 3 to 4 degrees to maximum daily temperatures during the record-breaking heat waves affecting England and Wales in May and June this year. An estimated 2,750 heat-related deaths occurred during this period. with approximately 1,155 of those deaths attributable to additional warming caused by climate change. That sort of evidence has direct implications for public health planning, emergency response, and adaptation policy. Incidentally, HKA will be hosting a panel session on the effects of climate change on epilepsy in October. Infrastructure owners are equally interested. Whether you're operating an airport, railway, power network, or water system, the key question is whether extreme weather events are becoming more likely and whether existing assets were designed for the climate of the past rather than the climate of the future. Associated with this are legal debates on the role of extreme weather events on construction delay. Climate attribution clearly has a role in answering the question, what did a contractor do to identify and assess the increased risk of extreme weather events, and was this sufficient to avoid delay? From my own background in air quality, there are interesting parallels. For decades, we've used source apportionment techniques, which is another way of saying attribution, to understand how much PM2.5, for example, originates from different sources and jurisdictions. The objective wasn't litigation, it was better decision-making. Climate attribution is increasingly serving the same purpose. It helps organisations understand where risks come from, how they're changing, and what interventions are likely to be most effective. So whilst litigation often captures the headlines, I think the broader significance of attribution science is that it allows organisations to make better informed decisions. In many cases, the most important question is not who will be responsible after a climate impact occurs, but what should we be doing today to avoid or reduce that impact in the first place?
So I think we've got a good idea now of where attribution science has got to, how it's relevant in litigation and how it's relevant in the broader sectors. Given your experience, how have you seen climate litigation change?
The first and perhaps biggest change I've seen is that climate change has moved from being seen as a future risk to being recognised as a present-day reality. When I started my career more than 30 years ago, climate change was often discussed in terms of projections for 2050 or 2100. It was an important policy and scientific issue, but many people still regarded it as a future challenge. Today, that has fundamentally changed. We're now seeing climate impacts play out in real time. Heat waves, droughts, flooding, wildfires, and sea level rise are no longer hypothetical scenarios. On a personal level, that reality was brought home to me recently when my family and I were evacuated from a holiday in southwest France because of wildfires. Experiences such as that remind us that climate change is no longer something we simply model or forecast. It is something people are experiencing. The second major change is that science has become more sophisticated. 30 years ago, much of the debate focused on whether climate change was happening and whether human activities were contributing to it. Today, the discussion has moved towards quantification. How much did climate change increase the likelihood of a flood? How much more severe was a heat wave because of anthropogenic warming? What proportion of climate risk can be attributed to a particular source of emissions? Attribution science is increasingly helping answer those questions. The air quality side of my brain finds that particularly interesting because there are parallels with the source apportionment work I referred to earlier. The difference is that climate attribution is being applied on a global scale. The third change is the nature of the litigation itself. Earlier climate-related challenges were often focused on environmental impact assessment, planning decisions, and regulatory compliance. Today we're seeing a much broader range of cases involving human rights, corporate governance, climate-related disclosures, adaptation responsibilities, and, increasingly, claims seeking compensation for climate-related harm. The fourth change is the growing scale of climate litigation and the emergence of collective claims. Climate change is unusual because its impacts are rarely confined to a single individual or community. Heat waves, flooding, drought, sea level rise, and other climate-related impacts often affect large numbers of people simultaneously. As a result, we're increasingly seeing attempts to pursue claims on behalf of groups of claimants and communities. Some of the most influential climate cases of recent years have reflected this trend. The Klimatscenarion case was brought on behalf of a group of older Swiss women who argued that inadequate climate action exposed them to increased health risks from extreme heat. We've also seen a growing number of claims brought by local authorities and communities seeking to address climate-related harms at a broader societal level. Interestingly, quite a few of those claims are in the United States. What is interesting is that attribution science is helping to support this evolution. As the ability to quantify climate-related risks and impacts improves, it becomes increasingly possible to demonstrate harm affecting groups rather than focusing solely on individual claimants. More broadly, climate litigation is moving from isolated disputes towards questions of systemic risk and collective responsibility. That has the potential to make climate disputes larger, more complex, and more significant than many traditional environmental cases. And perhaps most importantly, climate litigation is no longer occurring in isolation. The same issues being considered in courts are also being considered by boards, insurers, lenders, investors, and regulators. Questions about climate risk, resilience, adaptation, disclosure, and responsibility have become mainstream business issues. So if I were to summarize the change in a single sentence, it would be to say that when I started my career, climate change was largely a forecasting problem. Today, it is an operational, financial, and legal reality. Litigation has expanded from planning and permitting disputes to questions of human rights, corporate accountability, collective claims, and compensation for climate-related harm, supported by a level of scientific evidence that simply did not exist 30 years ago.
And as an expert and a scientist, you get to sit at the cross-section of all of those developments, which must be incredibly exciting. For our final question, what do you see as the greatest legal or non-legal barrier to addressing climate change?
Well, for me, the greatest barrier is no longer scientific uncertainty. The science has advanced enormously over the last 30 years. In fact, one of the most striking developments is how much more confident we can be in quantifying climate risks and impacts through attribution science. The biggest challenge is what happens after the science is understood. In many respects, climate change has become an issue of governance, communication, and decision-making, rather than one of scientific evidence. We live in an environment where information travels quickly, but so does misinformation. Complex scientific findings are often reduced to simplistic narratives, and genuine uncertainty can be misrepresented as ignorance. That can make it difficult to distinguish between evidence-based conclusions and opinion. A related challenge is political expediency. The benefits of tackling climate change are often realized over decades, whereas the cost of action can be immediate and visible. That creates a temptation for governments of all persuasions to delay difficult decisions, dilute commitments, or prioritize short-term political considerations over longer-term resilience. Saying that, I was pleased to see that the 7th carbon budget for the UK was recently passed into law. From my perspective, this is where attribution science becomes valuable. It helps move the discussion from ideology to evidence. It allows us to quantify risks, understand consequences, and make better informed decisions. It does not tell us what policy choices to make, but it provides a strong factual foundation on which those choices can be based. As for the legal system, I think the law is adapting. Courts can clarify responsibilities, establish accountability, and test decision-making, but they cannot solve climate change. Ultimately, success depends on whether we as a society are prepared to act on the evidence available. So if I may, I'll close with a suitably punchy soundbite for you. Climate change is ultimately a physics problem, but solving it is a human problem.
Thank you very much for your time today, Matt. That's been exceptionally interesting.